So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at 1.61 lesson 2, and we're going to be looking mainly at licensing of software. So basically, to start off with, when you create some software, be it an app or a game or whatever software you're making, you have to release it in some way with a license. And what a license is, it dictates what people can do with the software that they get or buy, but not always buy, because you might believe that when you buy some software you own it and it's yours and you can do whatever you want with it, but actually that isn't true. You buy it with a license and you're agreeing that you're going to follow the terms of license. There's also something called the end user license agreement, which dictates that you're going to use the software in a certain way. So one of the ones we're going to mainly look at, though, the two types of licenses we're going to mainly look at now, though, are the open source license. Now, basically, the whole idea of open source is that generally it's free. It's completely free. So by open, it means you can see it. So what you can actually do with open source software is download the code. So you can actually even see how the program was made. The idea behind open source is to be free, is to have people write their own add-ons to it, have people improve the code. So two famous pieces of open source software: Blender, which I will quickly show you here, which is completely free, which is here you go, I'll show you here. It is probably one of the best open source pieces of software. It's a 3D graphics program, a bit like Maya or 3ds Max, but obviously it is free. But apparently a lot of companies are now saying that the amount of people using Blender and the way that the licenses have gone with the other software, they're making it very expensive basically, mean that a lot of big companies are moving over to Blender and actually using it for top work. So that's one of them. Another piece of open source software is Linux, which is an operating system. So that's open source, so you can open that up and see how it's done. And Linux is a great example of what open source allows, because there are many versions of Linux. Okay, some are more like Windows, some are more, they're completely different. And that was possible because the source code was there to look at. And so, yeah, you can then obviously write your own versions, change it. Linux is one of the most customizable operating systems because of that reason. So open source, okay, it's usually free to download, and you can edit and distribute the changes you make to the software. So the advantages to open source are that users can edit it freely. You normally get a good social aspect with it. Blender and Linux have got huge online communities, so it's good for people that are using open source software, because you've got to look at this two different ways. You've got to look at the people using it or the people who created it. So for people using it, obviously it's free, okay, and because there's lots of people working on it, if you want a feature put in, you might be more likely to get it because you could actually just get someone to put the feature in, yourself. If you made the software, you don't get paid, but it does often give you a big name. I mean, because people will often download free stuff, rather than pay for stuff, especially from a new user. So the problem with open source is that obviously to edit the code you need expert knowledge. Debugging can be hard because who is in charge of this piece of software once it goes out into the world? And there are people in charge of like Blender, but there's lots of different coders working on it, and they might have a different style, so it can be a bit more difficult. It's obviously not a paid for piece of work, so you can't expect there to be certain amount of updates. You're just risking and hoping that things get fixed. So you're relying on the support of others, and there's a possibility that there's something malicious going on, although that could be true of other software, but it's more likely. And if you're selling the software, because think about this from a user, you've got to remember this is two sides to this. There's the user, as in using the software, or the creator. And if you create open source software, obviously you don't get any money for it, so that's a big disadvantage for the creator of it. Anyway, proprietary software, which is the software you're normally used to buying, okay, it costs money to buy, and normally has many features. Normally, if you're paying for a product, normally you get better products when you pay for them. I think Blender and a few others, there's quite a few good video editors, but in the end, the paid for software is generally considered better, and that's just the way it is. So more features. And like I said before, there'll be updates and fixes and stuff which you might not get. Like you know, if it's a free piece of software, are they testing it on loads of different hardware? Probably not. And so you might find that your program, you know, you've got another program and it interferes with that, and they're like, well, we're not going to fix it because you're just one person. So advantages of using proprietary software are that normally you get support, you know, it's professional. If there's something wrong, you've got someone that you can say, I paid for this, fix it, you know, and there's bugs, fixes, etc. here. Disadvantages to proprietary software is that it costs. You know, you're limited to that one program. If they don't expand it, you're stuck. Whereas if you're using open source, you can go to another open source software without having to pay again. Yeah, and that's basically on the screen. You can read them. So what you've got to understand is there's two sides to this. Okay, this is the side of these slides here are mostly focusing on the person using the software. But just be careful in the exam. It doesn't say something like Steve releases a piece of software as open source. What are the advantages? Well, now you've got to think about what will be the advantages to the person making it, and they're a little bit different. Okay, so just to understand that the advantages for a person making their program open source are that they get a bit more you know, like advertising, because more people are going to download it. People can help you improve your code. People can come back and suggest improvements, and people may also improve your project. So that's a bonus for open source for you as a writer of the program. But obviously a downside is you don't get any money, so that's obviously a major flaw with open source. And with proprietary software, it's kind of the opposite in that, you know, people might not buy your software, and therefore you don't really get anything out of it anyway, and it doesn't really do anything for you. So yeah, another thing of open source is that people can sort of take it and do what they want with it to some degree. So just understand that this is the advantages for the user. So you might want to also mention the ones as the creator of the program. Okay, so you might want to have, you know, little section for creator. So I want you to create a mind map showing the difference. So I'm just going to do a quick example. Obviously, you can draw the mind map and then take a picture of it and upload it to me. Brilliant. So in the middle, do the licensing. Then you would have open source. Sorry about that, might be wrong. And then you'd have open source, and you'd have proprietary, and then you can have like user of software, creator of software, and then you can talk about them separately. So we'd have user, and that's someone who uses the software, and then creator, and that's the person who created the software. And then you can obviously, I don't know how you want to colour these better than that, obviously. And then you obviously, as a mind map goes, you link it all up. I'm not going to do a great job. And then you can put the advantages, disadvantages, you know, of the different types, because it is important to know that they're different depending on whether you made the software as the creator or programmer. You could put programmer, or whether you're a user, because they're not the same. Okay. Obviously, that's what you've got to do. Don't do it. You can do it on the computer, but I'd rather you did it on a piece of paper, and then you just take a picture and upload it to Teams. There you go.